Good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining. My name is Rav and I'm the Program Manager at Reactor London. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our Code of Conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, and please be kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat will be open throughout and we do encourage you all to participate. Please note that this session will be recorded and will be available to view on our YouTube channel. We're back again with another table topic, which is smashing your sustainability goals. This session will be led by Richard and Darshna. They're both Microsoft MVPs. And with that, I'm now going to invite them over on the screen. Hello, both.
Hi, Rav. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Rav.
Hello. I'm going to hand it over to you. I'll be in the background. If you need me, just shout.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to share some intro slides. Can you see them? I'll take it as a yes.
We can.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. So thank you for joining us for this post-build table topic on smashing your sustainability goals. I'm Darshna Shah. I'm a Microsoft AI MVP and I'm the Director of Innovation at Sustainability Studio. I'm joined today by Richard Conway too.
Hi, everybody. I'm Richard Conway. I'm both a Microsoft Regional Director and an Azure MVP. I'm the CEO of a data science and data analytics consultancy called ElasticCloud that was the birthplace of Sustainability Studio. And hopefully today we can share a number of things about our journey.
So in terms of agenda, we'll kick off with a few topics that we find interesting, and then hopefully all you lovely participants will be able to join in and maybe ask us a few questions and get some interesting conversations going off the back of it. So we've actually picked a few topics around technology and sustainability based on an ebook that we wrote earlier this year. So we're hoping to cover topics around what makes successful sustainability leadership, what are green skills and how do we start to build them within our teams, what data is needed for effective ESG scoring and regulation compliance. And then we'll talk a bit more broadly around green technology and some of the applications specifically within AI from a sustainability point of view. And we'll share some useful resources as we kind of go along. Okay, so kicking us off, a recent kind of Microsoft study showed that only 41% of organizations are on track to meet net zero by 2050. I think this is quite a shocking fact, given the urgency of our need to kind of progress towards becoming more sustainable, given the climate emergency. But given probably our conversations with a lot of our customers, I don't think it's particularly surprising. I think it's become sort of kind of a mega trend, I guess, right? So we can see a lot of people kind of taking action towards trying to become more sustainable and setting a lot of ambitious goals, but it's kind of confusing. There's a lot of noisy information out of there from kind of lots of different frameworks to standards and data sets that should be collected, some of which don't exist, technologies that should be used to kind of collect different data sets. And I think that can add to kind of the chaos of trying to achieve those goals. What do you think, Rich?
I think that the problems associated with this are so broad, and the more you sort of delve into the role of technology, the more you realize that sometimes we're not actually ready to put technical solutions in place, right? And I think part of the problem is that people know what's coming, but because there isn't any proper enforcement at the moment, and there's confusion over the standards, as you've said, Dash, that people are almost like a squirrel in headlights, right? What are we going to do, right? Which standard do we report on? Who are we even reporting to? Because we're sort of in a holding pattern at the moment, I would say. One of the things that I think is really interesting here is how different organizations seem to define sustainability, right? We break this down into ESG.
Yeah.
But some organizations like we've spoken to in the insurance sector will look at just a part of this. There are others that will focus mainly on the social. The markets are really interested in governance, of course, because they want to understand financial control. So where does this end, and how do you prioritize this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think there's a lot of kind of broad frameworks trying to address kind of things that are kind of consistent across the board that allow us to have some sort of comparison. I mean, we've got a few kind of key points on ESG frameworks, which I know we'll go into to kind of understand what are the differences between them. Some may be kind of more applicable to certain industries. Others might be kind of more applicable to which part of ESG are you more focused on. I think it's quite interesting because obviously we need capital to go in the right areas so that businesses and industries can grow in the right way. But I think the way that it's being tackled by financial institutions versus corporations themselves are quite different. And I think at some point it's quite important that we have that convergence point so we're kind of speaking the same language. Otherwise, I think there will be kind of stumbling blocks. In a kind of a similar way, I guess, when technologists come into the room and we're speaking to business people, there needs to be that translation. So I guess we'll cover that in a bit more depth.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in as well, because I know that Sustainability Studio has a focus around financial institutions and asset managers and wealth managers. And I recently looked into this, and one of the things that I found absolutely incredible is that, here we are, everybody's talking about these, these net zero absolutes, in 2030. And, we're still making it optional for people to fund sustainable or non-sustainable products, whether they're green bonds or other things. Do you think there needs to be a shake-up in this area?
Yeah, definitely. I think the financial institutions are doing a great job at kind of forcing a lot of organizations to be better. Like some won't even be considered I think one of the kind of risks that a lot of investors talk about is the risk of organizations not mitigating or adapting towards climate change. And depending on what kind of investment you're engaged in, which fund, what their policies are, there'll be different timelines as well at which they're trying to consider, which I think organizations need to kind of be aware of to understand, okay, well, this is how we're being perceived externally, and this is our actual impact. So if we're going to look at that in a little bit more depth, we need to consider it from multiple angles, not just our own point of view, which I think is quite often, it's easy just to surround yourself in, this is our little industry bubble, this is where we sit compared to our competitors. But more broadly, it's kind of, I think that's where the kind of confusion with frameworks comes in. So there's so many, but two that are kind of really commonly used are GRI and SASB. But GRI are kind of universal. They have one set of kind of metrics that can be almost applied to any industry in the world, whereas SASB have the generic metrics, but they also have very specific industry-specific metrics for 77 different industries. And that's where you get into like material issues, which then you're looking at your own industry, you're not looking at across the board. And I think just from a wider society kind of point of view, we do need to understand what is more across the board, because yes, it's great that obviously industries like oil and gas, the home built environment, they're very carbon intensive industries. They do need to kind of look at kind of how can we innovate and create tools and new technologies and become reliant on more renewables, maybe shift more that way. How do we kind of diversify a little bit more? But then at the same time, it's kind of like, if you're an investor, you're not necessarily going to be building funds based on one industry. You might be looking more broadly. So in that case, you need those metrics to be able to compare across industry as well. So I think it's quite a complex area. There definitely does need to be kind of external push, maybe from kind of governmental and regulatory kind of organizations. And I think progress is kind of going in the right direction, but maybe it needs to be accelerated. And I know there are a lot of efforts across the board, from whether you're taking the business perspective, whether you're a financial institution. And I think a lot of the new upcoming regulations are kind of supporting a lot of those mega trends that we see. But I guess in the next kind of decade or so, we'll kind of see hopefully progress that we need to see.
Okay, well, so not to sound cliche, so we're still a ways away from one sustainability reporting framework to rule them all.
Yeah.
How are the 7 pillars of leadership going to help tighten this then?
Yeah, so this was actually really interesting. So this is from a survey that was taken from the boards of 80 different institutions, and they identified from those kind of qualitative interviews 7 pillars which they found made successful sustainability leadership. And a few of them are quite common sense, and other ones just kind of are good just to reflect on, I think, because it is such a dynamic space, and I don't think it's necessarily going to be down to one person. If we're looking at leadership specifically, there are different roles and functions within a leadership board, which will all consider sustainability from a different perspective. But I think one of the core themes that sits across all of those different perspectives is data and technology. For us to make progressive change, we do need to utilize data. We need to collect data that's not being collected necessarily, and incorporate it into our business as usual. So it shouldn't be an afterthought. In the same way we think of cost and security, sustainability should also be incorporated into all those decisions. So these 7 pillars kind of, I guess, build on that. So in terms of active engagement, yes, it is a mega trend, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, right? So kind of boards need to be more aware of not only issues that are material to their business, but kind of more broad scope. What are the regulations upcoming? What are the nearest changes? How does that happen? How does that kind of diversify across geographies? If you're a multinational, you might have functions in the US, in Europe, maybe even in Asia, and we haven't got that point of convergence yet. So there will be different rules and frameworks that are suggested for that. So we kind of need to go a little bit in kind of more of depth in terms of active engagement. Leading by example, I think this is one I think we talk about regularly internally. I think this is more, it's not necessarily lead by example, it works both ways. But I think if you kind of have that cultural change kind of evolved within your organization, it can inspire people to want to influence change towards a more sustainable future. So I think if kind of leadership boards are kind of saying, okay, these are our targets, but then going one step further and breaking that down and saying, okay, well, this is how we intend to change it by making these kind of new processes, using these new tools, etc. It kind of encourages people to think, well, what can I do? Is there a better way that we can do things? So I think that's definitely a positive.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, I always think the first month, and obviously this is not to quote a silver lining for the pandemic, but I remember the first month after we had the home curfews and these kinds of things. The air was so much cleaner where I live, and just understanding that there was going to be a huge cultural change, regarding remote work and office work. All of these things have an impact, obviously, on the culture of an organization. But I mean, we also, one of the things that we've been recording a lot is scoped emissions, which has a big footprint in this. And,
definitely.
Just understanding the scoped emissions that you can calculate off of the back of having meetings or flying around to various parts of the world because you have to be physically present, right? And having that whole culture change, right, is an impact. How do we be consistent with this and give this more continuity? If you were a top tier CEO of a FTSE 100 company, what would you do to bring in that culture and that community spirit into the organization?
Well, that's a really good topic to cover. I think it's quite a complex one. We could probably talk about this just in and of itself. But I think some of the things we've done within our team specifically is firstly around education, right? Just I think sometimes people take it for granted. I know we were recently at the National Museum of Computing, and we were giving a session on climate change and technology within climate change and sustainability to pupils that were at year 7, so they're around 12 or 13. And even with kind of iconic personas like Greta Thunberg, these kids were still, I don't think it quite it didn't set home exactly what the impact was. And one of the great questions that came about was, well, if we do nothing, I was explaining the representative concentration pathways and the business as usual one. If we do nothing, what is the impact? What will happen? And I was kind of giving these broad kind of global examples of what could happen. And then Sandy, who was also co-leading the session with me, said, well, 30% of London's actually going to be underwater. And that is what hit home with them, wow. Right? Because it impacted them, it impacted where they live, it impacted where they go to school. Yeah. And in the same way with our teams, it's kind of like, well, they need to understand the impact to them. And it can't just be kind of broad global education. We kind of need to go in a bit more depth. So when we're talking about architecture, it's just like, I remember we were saying, turn your screen off, don't leave it on standby. In the same way, if we've got redundant data sources, we delete them. If we've got redundant resources in Azure, delete them, because we don't necessarily need them. So just some very simple low-hanging fruit practices, I think, can really encourage people just to say, okay, well, this is now in my daily routine. Yeah. I'm thinking about this all the time. It's not just like a high level consideration anymore.
So this is a reconditioning of our thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's definitely a great start. Education, process change. Again, it comes back to kind of that whole incorporating sustainability within everything we do. I think before we've not really considered kind of like natural capital and what we take from the environment in all of our processes. But everything we do affects the environment and the home of Earth that we all live in. So I think that's definitely the right thing to do.
Speaking about that catastrophic example you gave about 30% of London being underwater, I read a really interesting summary of a paper the other day. And I think it was by one of the Big Four who'd recently done a study. And the outcome of it was that financially, if we hit a tipping point, it would cost the global economy just under $200 trillion to self-correct. But if we manage to get our act together, potentially we could globally create industries and wealth of around $43 trillion. So we've got everything to play for here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that it kind of goes back to kind of green skills, right? And kind of developing our teams on that basis. So I think LinkedIn recently did a report that showed between 2015 and 2021, the kind of the proportion of jobs that had increased with regards to renewables or environment had gone up by 238%, which is crazy. So I think it's definitely a move in the right direction, and it's good to see that kind of thing, because it's encouraging, like, okay, we have hope that all these ambitious targets that we have, and this decade is critical for that, where we're kind of moving in the right direction. Whether the speed is correct is another issue, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I mean, so it's happy times if you're in sustainability at the moment, right?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. So just moving on to the other 7 pillars of the sustainability leadership. So ambitious long-term goals, that's kind of, as we've discussed, kind of not talking about business as usual. If we're setting these really long-term goals around becoming net zero, we actually need to break those down. Again, that can kind of help organizations be kind of perceived in a more favorable light, not just by investors, but also by consumers of different products as well.
This was one of the things that, because I know that you wrote quite an interesting discourse around this in our ebook, and this was one of the things that really hit home that I'd never thought about. You look on the news, right, and everybody's talking about their net zero targets from 2025 to 2050, right?
Yeah.
And when you read it, it's meaningless.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's like it's so far away And that if you're a few years away, then any company, any large enterprise can go, well, we're not on track, right, in 2045. So I think we need to start having more demands, because we have these long-term goals, right? They mean nothing unless you have these short-term goals in between.
I think that's just a really interesting area of contention as well, just in terms of the kind of, I guess, distribution of how we kind of consider the strategies towards that as well. So I know two of the kind of key ones are investing in renewables and offsetting. So offsetting has been tied to a lot of fraud, and I think that this is another thing that we kind of just need to be a bit more conscious of, is the fact that it's not a marketing exercise. We're not greenwashing this away to net zero. It's easy to chuck money at things. I think Carbon Plan was the organisation that found an organisation in the US that had took $400 million in offsetting funds and not removed a single ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think it's not just a case of, okay, we create these great strategies. Oh yeah, we've actually said this is how we're going to break it down. We're going to offset. We're going to invest here. It actually needs to be verified as well, right?
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas that I have a big problem with, and that we've had so many conversations about what it actually means for polluter pays, and this whole principle, it's taught in economics classrooms right across the world, right? But what does it actually mean when you create negative externalities, right? If we actually worked out realistically, the technologies that can redeem and capture that carbon, right? They're expensive technologies, right? Are we actually paying the value, the technical value, right, of what it would take to engineer a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere as compared to a carbon certificate? And I think we're a long way off from that.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess it's all down to leadership as to how we get closer to it.
Yeah. So just we'll quickly go through the other three pillars, I guess. Executive compensation tied to sustainability performance. I guess that one's a kind of common sense one, right? If you're incentivized to reach certain sustainability goals, you're likely to drive attention and capital in those areas. Innovation, I think we kind of touched on, right? So our business as usual processes across many industries are just not going to cut it. We need to diversify, create new processes, new technologies that enable us to reach those goals.
So I'm just going to pause on this, because one of the things that I'm really interested in, because I feel like a lot of innovations don't actually get off the ground because they're measured in very, very simple financial terms, right? So you might have all these startups who are coming up with the most incredible engineering, and I know that you and I have been on calls with people that do carbon sequestration underground, and they're building these caverns, and they've had so much problems, right, being able to finance this, right? Definitely. Because going from scratch, right, with the technology to a long-term agenda to say, well, our payback is not going to be for another 5 to 10 years. It's really, really hard. How do we relax this in this world where we have access to money, right? But the financial payback isn't now, because the polluter pay principle isn't being adhered to by people.
Yeah, I think that's a really common problem we see, not just at the organizational level, but even when we're talking to organizations that are looking to report their scope 3 emissions better, for example. Is well, we can't have this whole infrastructure and this team. We need a small proof of concept to show the value of it first. And it's almost like there needs, because it's such a new area, a lot of kind of proof of concepts and development work needs to kind of show the value of that and kind of give people that trust and kind of confidence, I guess, in yes, it will pay back. I think that's kind of the key thing. But then I guess that kind of goes back to the speed as well, right? It's like slowing the whole process down again, and you kind of having to go and make incremental kind of small changes rather than committing to longer term changes, which is really a really important consideration.
Yeah, I think for me, I think this is where governments could definitely have more of an impact, and you can see this in examples like NASA and SpaceX.
Yeah.
Right. SpaceX, we've now, the US has built a a private space industry off of the back of a set of NASA contracts because private industry was innovating faster. So I think more of these things need to be government led. We need to understand how to link these to public goods, merit goods, like we do with the schooling system, the health system.
Yeah, I think that's another really interesting area as well. It's kind of like we can't have this disparity between geographical regions. At some point there needs to be some alignment across different countries as well. We were talking actually around a few of our friends were talking about renewables the other day, and so it's only actually beneficial for if you're looking at a solar plant, for example, you're producing the most amount of energy when the demand is the lowest at midday, right? So if you don't have capability to store that, it's just waste.
Yeah.
You need some sort of mechanism to redistribute it. If we kind of had one of our friends kind of just put forward a really great idea is if we were able to kind of get our act together and have a system that was kind of global where we can redistribute energy according to where it was needed the most, because there'll be different time regions, etc., then that could be a really great way of this kind of bypassing this whole need to store energy so that it's effective at the time.
Yeah, I remember reading a paper on the European supergrid that stretched all the way from North Africa with solar in the desert all the way to I think Denmark and what are they called, the Baltic countries, and which are really good at wind generation.
Yeah.
And this was supposed to cut down the volatility. I think that part of the problem that we've got with our infrastructure is that it's like 150 years old.
Yeah.
We've progressed now. We've got superconductors. But nobody wants to pay the upgrade bill.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of interesting kind of topics just within sustainability broadly and leadership. Building on the kind of sustainability leadership roles a bit further, this is kind of what we were touching on around different roles within leadership will focus on different things, which is why data may be the common thread, but they'll be used for different purposes. So the CEO is looking at kind of future visions and strategic threats and opportunities. We have the CFO who's looking at financial planning, capital allocation, investment opportunities. And then we have our operations officer, which is kind of looking at where we're kind of sourcing our requirements from to meet demand, looking at the supply chain kind of end of things. Our CTO, who kind of has a dual function in the sense that we're looking to innovate new kind of processes, but also looking at what is our hardware kind of consumption from a carbon point of view as well? What can we move to the cloud? How do we build effective architectures in the cloud as well? Our commercial officer, who's looking to make sure that we have an alignment with the kind of brand the company has, and ensuring that product design kind of meets those sustainability goals as well. The chief sustainability officer, who often has a lot of kind of pressure from a sustainability point of view and not always the means to deliver against those ambitious goals, but they do have the power to generally veto decisions that conflict with the strategy. And then we have our HR officer, who is kind of looking to embed that sustainability education and cultural trends within an organization, from training to talent acquisition. And then I guess building on a little bit further on that, where we kind of want to instill some of these kind of green skills, which look at not only the basics of climate science, but also what makes good sustainability data. How can we use that? Whether we're developing an IoT infrastructure that enables us to monitor our scope 1 and 2 emissions a little bit better, and also the upcoming regulations. So I know CSRD is going to affect around 50,000 companies across the EU, depending on size and turnover. So that's probably going to be expanded over time. So these things that probably all organisations need to be starting to think about, because it can impact kind of
CSRD. What
I think it's already in effect.
Okay.
But like I said, it's just affecting larger companies. I think they have over 500 employees, a balance sheet of 20 million euros, or turnover of 40 million euros. So yeah, I think that will definitely be expanded. I know the UK, although we're not part of the EU specifically, we do have similar kind of upcoming regulations, hopefully coming into play as well, that align with that. So there are kind of multiple perspectives here that would use. So if we look at supply chain data, for example, our operations officer may look to see, okay, do we have the right suppliers? Can we work with our suppliers to become more sustainable? In a similar way, our commercial officer needs to make sure there's no reputational risk. So if, for example, one of our suppliers comes out and there's some sort of controversy related to the workforce or any kind of other environmental situation, that's obviously going to carry some reputational risk. So two very different roles looking at the same supply chain data, but from different perspectives from a sustainability point of view.
Got you. It was interesting what you said about the Chief Sustainability Officer, because this CSO is a relatively new role and it's a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've found is that companies that might be on FTSE or AIM, the CSOs don't really have the same kind of budgets as the other officers, do they?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know from a lot of the conversations we've had with various different customers, they're very much at the beginning of their journey, and it's quite ambitious, some of the goals that they're set, because either data doesn't exist or they're in silos, and it's kind of like, well, we need to kind of get that together first before we can even begin to look at any of these additional intelligent applications that we can look to improve our overall processing of how we deal on a day-to-day basis.
So would you say at the moment then the more immediate function of the CSO is to almost police the fact that there's sustainability strategies with all the other officers?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, that is, I guess, how it's supposed to work. But from our kind of conversations, I kind of almost feel like they don't actually have that much power. And in fact, they're probably trying to work with other roles to see how they can actually meet their own objectives.
Yeah, understood.
So I think it's quite a dynamic role. And going back to that whole, it's not going to, these ambitious goals are not going to rest as the responsibility of one single person. It really does take the team working together. And I guess everybody, that sustainability to be on everybody's agenda for actually progressive change to be seen.
Yeah, understood. I mean, I can't help but think when I look at this, picture of these 7 roles, that I mean, every single role here is incredibly important in sustainability. I think that the CEO and the CFO probably need to be very, very tuned in something that I know that you've been quite engaged in with RWA, who've published their green methodology and revenue at risk.
Yeah, they have some really cool mathematical models that they've put forward, which attempt to exactly kind of align economic risk with our environmental and governance risk. So we can kind of get a more holistic picture of where we sit, which I think is the right direction to go into. But translating that from a theory to actual day-to-day practice is a very different thing. And I think a lot of boards aren't quite there yet. There are some that are making huge progressive changes, but I don't think it's like the norm, I guess, for most organizations.
Right. Okay. So it's really, I'm finding this really, really interesting, because I've seen this diagram a few times, but now that we're actually talking about this, I'm really thinking that there's a whole set of dependencies between all of these roles as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think data, and so I think the CTO has quite an important role, actually, because they can really empower the team to really use the data, because if they're in charge of kind of where data sits, security, etc., they can bring that all into one central location, so it can be used for that multifunctional purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think that there are lots of pressures all the way through. I mean, I'm looking at the CHRO training and talent, right? We know that in some of the more in some of the industries which are really trying to put themselves forward as sustainable, but like metals and mining, but they use huge amounts of water, and other soon to be scarce resources. You might have like younger workforces look at this and go, well, I'm not ethically attuned to this. And so you need to have, a real understanding from an HR perspective of who you are, and, and showing that progressive path, because otherwise, the next generation of people who are coming into
you're not going to attract the best talent. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely a thing with Gen Z. Like, they don't want to just work for any kind of company. They want to make sure it's in tune with who they are. It has some sort of wider social influence, and it's working towards something positive. So I know a lot of oil and gas companies have a lot of issues kind of retaining younger talent, primarily for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really helps to set out that strategy of, we're investing in the next generation of electrical vehicle chargers, and the next generation of solar, and the next generation of wind, and here it is, and how we're offsetting our operations, and what, if you can be really clear about that, then you can respond to a lot of these challenges with Gen Z.
Exactly. So specifically with the HR officer, I know, like, kind of storytelling and understanding, extracting out from those surveys the kind of case studies, I guess, that can represent those types of transitions is kind of really critical for talent acquisition, and also understanding from training, like, what's working well, what's not working well, where changes need to be made more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking at, because I don't want to leave out the CCO as the last one. The COO is the know all of everything, right? Everything that goes on, they have to know. But the Chief Commercial Officer, I think, also has a hard job, because they're going to need to align their values with customer values, right? And customers, if you're vacuous and you make stuff up, you're greenwashing, like you say, customers will be aware of it very quickly. And if you're large enough to be a public company, it can affect your share price.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've seen that in a few instances, haven't we?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So moving on from leadership and talking, I guess, more about data and technology. So one of the things we spoke at the beginning was around how much confusion there is with regards to what data do we need to collect, what's effective for us to make change. So there are many different frameworks, and kind of building on the ebook that we wrote earlier this year. This is a little kind of visual representation of how we see the many different frameworks that are out there, and they kind of vary across two kind of key areas in terms of how focused they are. So there are some frameworks that are purely focused on the environment, whilst there are others that are kind of more focused on environment, social, and governance. And then also in terms of how much detail they provide. So there are some that are going to give you right down to the very metric units that you should collect. And there are others that are kind of just loose advice and broad questionnaires that you can look at. So looking, I guess, at the top right-hand corner, we have GRI and SASB, which we discussed a little earlier. GRI being that really universal kind of framework, covering ESG, and also really closely aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, whereas SASB is really comprehensive, more and more also aligned with TCFD, which is accounting for a lot of those climate metrics, but also allows you to look at the industry-specific considerations from that materiality point of view as well. Moving on to the top right, we have those specific focused more on the environment side of ESG, but still providing a lot of detail. So we have TCFD, the CDP, which you go onto their website, they're looking at things like forestry activity, water security, and things like that. And then we kind of have, again, still environment focused, or in the case of GRESB, we're looking at more industry focused specific frameworks, but are providing that looser kind of advice, I guess.
Yeah, I know. I thinking back now, because it's the first time that we've spoken about GRESB for a while, and just because I get confused because I see so many acronyms with ESG frameworks. So sometimes I've confused SASB with GRESB when I've been talking, because they both end in B. I think what was interesting about GRESB, because I know that you did a sort of internal consult from Sustainability Studio to Intelligent Spaces, which is another application we built to monitor IoT and digital twins. And there was we were talking about a sustainability pack with GRESB, weren't we? Because of that low level of detail that we could put into sensor capture.
Exactly, it's very much aligned to that real estate home built environments industry, which is great. But I'm pretty sure you could probably get similar things from SASB as well. They would probably have an industry specific alignment to home built environments that allow you to look at things that are, I know there were things, specific focuses within IoT that we were looking at, which things like the number of bricks that are on site, for example, are things that aren't actually actively, they don't have an active inventory for it.
No.
So it's like, well, okay, so should we use kind of drones and sensors to estimate how much kind of bricks we have on site? So there were some really interesting, like, it's quite shocking when you're like, oh really, I thought you would have had an inventory on that. So that's quite interesting.
So I mean, let's just take a step back from the frameworks, right, and think about the pressures. Right, the industry as a whole is competing for a finite number of sustainability officers and key people in sustainability reporting, so there aren't enough in this field, which we've established. I look at a picture like this and I think, where do I start? So you've got the added problem of not having, not being able to consolidate all of these frameworks, because we're reliant on governments and standards bodies who we know traditionally move very, very slow. What is the answer? How do we get better reporting to the market, to investors, to, even for ourselves, so that we can be self-assured that we're a good citizen?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think there are some efforts. So I know there's a lot of work going on between a few of these organisations, particularly TCFD and SASB, where they're trying to consolidate it. So it's like they're not multiple different frameworks. There's just one that you can go and you'll know it will cover all the important aspects from quite a few different frameworks. So I think there were obviously a lot of good-natured efforts at the beginning to put out some sort of advice for people to start collecting the right types of data. But now we're kind of seeing the change that we do need, where it's like, okay, there's too many to pick from. And in some cases, so I know there was a really interesting study by the FTSE Russell Group that actually looked at how many of just the E metrics overlap with some of the technical screening criteria for the EU taxonomy, for example. And out of 300 metrics that are represented across some of these frameworks, only 43 aligned. So there's that disparity there as well between what data financial institutions are looking at to put the capital in the right area versus what institutions are looking at so they can get an adequate ESG score. So that is slowly converging.
Wow, that's like a 15%, less than 15% crossover.
Yeah, I was quite astonished when I saw that. I was like, oh, I didn't realize there would be, because you'd think that there's enough education out there now for people to say, okay, we know that these are the kind of core metrics and this is a nice to have. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And I guess it just shows how complex this area can be in terms of data. And it's kind of like, I think it was Forbes and it was Forbes that described data as the new oil, because it's kind of like there's so much of it, but what is actually useful and what can we use to make intelligent decisions? So you kind of need to use all that compute power to refine it and make sense out of it. So I think that's a situation where we are actively in at the moment as well.
Got you. Wow. Lots to do, eh? Yeah,
definitely. So let's skip over that. In terms of kind of more specific technological applications, obviously there is understanding climate change in more depth. So big data, machine learning is not new to climate science. But I think as more awareness has kind of grown, we have more technology resources available to us these days that are a bit more powerful. We're able to kind of understand weather patterns better, use that satellite imagery for other purposes as well, in terms of mitigating and adapting towards climate change. So we have here predicting energy demand. So we talked a little bit around the solar infrastructure. So if we can understand supply and demand better, we can look at where we can expand out those infrastructures. Discovering new materials. So we spoke about kind of the transition of oil and gas to kind of other renewable energy type designs, but also for discovering new materials. So solar fuels, if we want to look at chemical structures that are more effective at absorbing carbon, that will require a lot of AI and ML expertise. Optimizing transport. So I know electrical vehicle is something that we've looked at recently as well. So if we're looking to expand out that infrastructure, we kind of need to be aware of the biases that exist within data sets as well. So typically more affluent areas will have a higher adoption of electrical vehicles. So we need to make sure that that is kind of known when we're looking at building out infrastructure for charging ports, etc. Smart buildings. So we spoke a bit about IoT and the applications there. As we kind of move to more of a hybrid world, we want to allow people to have the freedoms, but we need to do that in a responsible way by heating and cooling buildings effectively, which IoT sensors and models built on top of that can help us do. Optimizing supply chains, precision agriculture at scale. So there are a lot of kind of interesting climate science papers actually that go into some of the carbon variability that we can see as a result of us repurposing land. So typically there is more land in the northern hemisphere, so we don't see as much variability. But as we're repurposing land for agricultural uses, expanding our cities, we do see more carbon variability that is more in line to the southern hemisphere. So if we're able to not strip all of the nutrients out of our lands and allow more kind of rotational crop growing through understanding agricultural patterns, that will be a big bonus as well. Illegal deforestation. This was actually on the news the other day where I think it was in the UK, they've made it illegal for certain peatlands, which are carbon reservoirs, to be set on fire, which is quite common practice, but actually found that they still were in large proportions of area. And I think it was Greenpeace who identified this from satellite imagery. Amazing. So kind of enforcing, helping law enforcement with that illegal type of activity would be really powerful.
Back to polluter pays again, right?
Yeah. And then finally, advertising. So kind of educating our consumers around energy saving products and just giving them other options.
Amazing.
So there's quite a few there.
I think one of the things, being a sci-fi buff, one of the things that I'd like to see, and it may be that we can actually do some, we can build a calculator for this, but I've seen in some sci-fi programs that the sort of new city of the future, when we talk about a smart building, is also going to have different types of moss, lichen, plants on, whether it's on the rooftop or on the actual walls.
That would be cool.
So that they're a bit of a carbon sink as well.
Yeah.
And so maybe all this stuff should actually start locally, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think I have actually seen that in a few places in London specifically, where they've started to create these like really cool like rooftop gardens, which is really nice. It's just nice to see a bit more green, I guess, as well. It's quite calming from a mental health perspective.
And I think the interesting thing for me as well, because we were talking about this the other day, and one of the things that I was very, very surprised about is it's always contentious when you talk about the planting of new trees, because it's questionable as to how much carbon they actually remove from the atmosphere in their first 3 years as a first pass. But secondly, I think when you were telling me this, there's not a lot of tracking, right? So a lot of companies will pay for services of people to plant trees, and then that's it. We're done with it. And then there could be forest fires. They won't be upkept, and maybe 50% of a copse of trees will die before they can actually become a carbon sink.
Yeah, exactly.
So start local, put it on your own building.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good message to start with.
Yeah, I also, whilst this is up on the screen, I also wanted to complain about the lower barrier to EV adoption. I think that, again, this is something which is private industry led, and whilst the government have got like a lot of aspirations to proliferate this, and electric vehicles are here now, right? They're a solution now. The prices obviously have to come down, and generally, the more of something that you buy, the more tight production processes become, and they become cheaper to produce. I think one of my biggest bugbears having an EV is that unless you have a regulated EV supply, right? If you want to go and get a charge, you can have electric vehicle chargers that are just in a petrol station, in a car park, wherever, and they could be broken for about a week or two.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a real problem.
Yeah, it totally is when there's a limited number of them. So I think that we need to understand that they're here and now today, and we have a distribution network, and we just need to leverage that.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Okay, let's see if we have
any questions. Nothing else yet.
No questions at the moment. So with regards to the electrical vehicle where specific charging posts are broken, how long on average do you know how long on average they take to?
Oh, it can be anywhere between a few days and months. It's very, very irritating. And I think for example, near me, the council have several of them, and some of them have just been broken for months, and it's not clear who even owns them. They're a great sort of intermediate charging point for us, and I think that I've seen this in lots of different places in the country, and thankfully you've got applications like ZapMap, I think it's called ZapMap, yeah, where you have people like crowdsource information that complain about these things and go, well, I've just been here and it's broken, right? And then so you have a running audit, right, of the fact that a manufacturer or a service provider hasn't actually fixed this charger. So at least you can name and shame.
A lot of room for applications to be built to monitor, maybe even like those posts where people are reporting. Even something very simple could pick that up.
Yeah, I think so.
That's really interesting.
Oh, on that thread, Liam's asked a question. How long do you feel it will be until EVs are fully supported with the current infrastructure? How long is a piece of string? I think one of the things that intrigues me is that for years and years, people were talking about hydrogen-powered vehicles, and billions went into creating fuel cells, but nobody really thought about the distribution aspects of hydrogen. I think obviously electricity is very ubiquitous. It's easy to get this from the grid. We can even guarantee that it can come from a green source if we want to pay a little bit more. So I think everything's in place to deal with this challenge. The problem is that for fast chargers or superchargers, there needs to be quite an investment in infrastructure, and you need to have more and more providers in that will take this up and be happy to earn their money back over 5, 10, 15 years. I think the government can definitely do more to incentivize in this area. I know that in the UK we're looking at a crunch point of 2030, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where vehicles need to change around. We put constraints on diesel fuel, and soon there'll be constraints on petrol. So I think we're definitely heading in the right direction, but not fast enough. And the reality is that EV chargers just aren't popping up fast enough, and where they are, like I've said, they're not maintained enough.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, maybe we can wrap up on one last point. Maybe we could both share what we think our top tip for smashing your sustainability goals would be.
So I think that the piece that you wrote, which I alluded to before, about stretch and SMART goals is the most important thing for me. If you have these ambitious targets and you make all these public statements about where your net zero is going to be in 2030, 2050, then you have to back it up with an actionable plan that you publish. So don't say it if you're not going to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great one. I would probably go with one that is probably quite commonly known, but probably start collecting the right data. Think about it actively. Don't just rely on the data that we have currently existing, and do a little just to educate yourselves on what are the kind of most reliable frameworks to you that also future-proof you against a lot of regulation too.
We've got another question from Antonio.
Okay, the question is, considering the inflation due to gas scarcity, do you reckon growth is possible with only renewables? That's a really good,
it's a really good question, and brings in some sort of political content as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting one because obviously there are different strategies geographically. This has kind of been discussed in the news as well a lot. I don't think it's necessarily going to be we can flip over to renewables and that's going to solve all of our problems, because it requires a lot of governance around investing in the right areas, etc., and understanding what actually are the risks. So it's no good us putting wind farms where there's going to be huge risk of cyclones, whatever else. So it needs to be thought about in a lot of depth. I know there's an interesting study that actually looks as well at kind of the training of GPT-3, the NLP model, on different Azure data center regions according to carbon intensity of the region. And France always comes out as looking quite well because they're more nuclear based. Yeah, which is not necessary. I think that's also quite a reductionist point of view, given the very kind of the materials that require nuclear power to be put in the first place. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be if or one or the other. It's going to kind of be a transition where we're going to have to bring in intermediary resources at specific times of that kind of timeline.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that I would say, because this is an interesting question, and it sort of brings up the idea which everybody's discussing now because of the situation with Russia and Ukraine, of energy independence, right? So what does that energy independence mean in terms of, creating the right kind of export community? We know that certain places, like you say, produce wind energy, and it's not always easy to export this across borders. And then similarly, right, what is our new agenda, right? If we head towards energy independence, right, I guess, it's great to get the regulation in. We know that there was a lot of subsidies a while ago with solar, which have since eroded.
Yeah.
Should it be that the new mandate is anything new has to be, we have to be producing energy with renewables, and then bundled into that is all the site surveys to check biodiversity and all the other things that
definitely us. It's a complex area.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll catch you soon.
Thanks everyone.